2022, and this is the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting, and we do have a quorum. Our first opening item is 1.1, approval of the agenda. So moved by Rich, seconded by Ryan. And all in favor, please raise your hands. That passed unanimously. Thank you. And are there any requests for changes at this time? If not, I actually have two, please. The first one is I would like to add as item number 3.5 and bump down 3.5 to 3.6 to talk about construction policy 2.11. And then also we need to change the agenda to read that 3.2 policy 2.9 updates will come from Mr. Miller and not from myself. So with those changes, do I need a motion for those changes as well, Matt? Yes. Okay, I need a motion for those changes. If everybody, first by Susan, seconded by Jesse, all in favor? Wonderful, that was a unanimous approval. Next on the agenda, 1.2 is public comment. We do not have anyone in the bullpen, but is there anyone on online, Deb?
No, there's not.
Oh, interesting. All right, well, we will close public comment for the first time I think I've ever seen that.
Should we do a welfare check?
I don't know, I wonder. That's a very good question. All right then, moving on to 1.3, general announcements. Are there any general announcements this time? Seeing none, we're just going to keep this ball moving. We are now on to 2. Consent agenda. And would somebody like to move the consent agenda as a motion? That would be Ryan, and seconded by Kyra. Is there any discussion on the motion? If not, let's go ahead and take a vote then. Everybody in favor of the consent agenda, please raise your hands. All right, that was unanimous as well. We're moving very quickly here, and I was not prepared for that. All right, we are now on to policy monitoring and development. And first on our agenda is 3.1, annual plan of work. And so in your board packets on page 17 is an attachment. It outlines the previous board work plan and education plan, as well as previous topics that the board wished to pursue. And I'd like to hear board member thoughts on previous suggestions, as well as hear any new suggestions that the board may have. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas? Yes, Susan.
Thank you. I raised this question at our retreat during the dialogue we had about the propulsion study. That was an excellent study, and I learned a lot. But what struck me when I read the report was it felt like a very specific tactic. And what was missing for me was a larger strategy that spoke to our sustainability efforts. So an example, we as an agency purchase other vehicles. Our staff are operating vehicles throughout our system. Could we create and I don't know what the right word is, a limitation for our CEO or some guidance for our staff that speaks to things like an overall sustainability approach, that maybe those vehicles may be aiming toward zero emission. I raised at the time of the budget approval that many millions of dollars will be spent on construction. And one of the very important opportunities we have is at the time of planning and construction of big buildings, a chance to design them with sustainability at the heart of the design, and that this larger sustainability approach as an umbrella statement would give guidance to staff about our values. And so as a part of the work plan for the coming year, I guess I'm tossing this out to my colleagues on the board to see if you would also be interested to work with Rose and with me and others to developing what the language would look like. That would be a broader statement about our goals, under which things like propulsion of the buses would fit, as well as all those other things I mentioned. So that would be a plan of work that I would find very satisfying and I think very impactful. So I'd be interested to hear if others would be interested.
Simi?
Yeah, thank you. I very much agree, Susan. I'd be interested in work on that as well, and developing a way to get it into policy. There's more focus on sustainability. I was recently reading through what we heard from the long-range planning. Sustainability was all throughout there was the environmental impact of the ride operations beyond just the bus fleet. So I think you're right. I felt similarly with the propulsion study that it's a somewhat narrow focus in terms of all of the rides operation. Having something in the policy that is more holistic, I think, would be really effective.
Yes, Eric, sorry.
I mean, I think it's worthwhile work, but I think this, to me, this is a staff issue to me. This is operational in nature, and I think it's a staff issue. I think our role is to say we want to see a sustainability end of some kind or ends described in our end statements, and we can drive that. And I think it's up to the staff to come up with a sustainability plan. The minute we start stepping into, hey, let's get the language together, because this is sounding very meansy to me and very like we're going to prescribe the way that you're going to do sustainability here. I don't mind the broader focus of a general sustainability effort, of which propulsion can be one aspect of that, but I see this really as staff work. So I mean, I would encourage us to come up with the proper ends and the language that Susan is talking about to give to the staff, have them come back with a sustainability plan that we can approve or not approve, and have them drive that. But I think it's going to be one of those things where it's going to be very easy for us to cross the line into prescribing, hey, here's what the sustainability plan should be, or having the staff say at least it should have these elements. I think the way we want to guide them is to say, here's the ends policy, here are the elements we want in our sustainability focus, and let them come back with it, as opposed to saying we want to see A, B, C, and D specifically in it. That's just my thought.
Any other thoughts on this subject? For me, I think that we do already have currently going on an ends review, that may be the best place to look at this when we review our ends and make sure that, I know that there is something there on sustainability, but if it doesn't meet our current concerns, our needs, that might be the more appropriate way to look at it. But I'm also hearing that there may be an opportunity, availability for the board to receive more education on sustainability and what that looks like. I mean, we could, right now, the reason that we're having this discussion is to get as many topics out and things that we want to explore over the next year, and then in December we will whittle them down and make a final decision. But I want to make sure that I'm writing all of this down appropriately so that we can have a greater discussion in December and write them down. But what do you think about what I proposed in terms of sustainability and the ends coming up? Yes, Simi.
So it was my understanding that the ends are very short comments, and we already have, like you said, Kathleen, in the end, public transportation options minimize energy use and pollution. My thought was maybe this goes in executive limitations, that something about the organization shouldn't be run without a sustainability plan that might encompass these elements. I'm not sure I mean, we already because we already say minimizing energy usage, how we can change that further touch the sustainability aspects we're thinking of. So I guess I agree we shouldn't, step in where staff have their authority to create a sustainability plan or whatever it is. But I guess I'm wondering if this could maybe go in executive limitations to get a little bit deeper than just what would be in the ends policy.
Eric, you had some really good thoughts. Do you want to add to that with this concern?
Well, I think just the way Simi described it, I think goes right to the concern I had, is you're not going to fail to do it, and it's not going to fail to have these elements, and then it's just easy to start tripping one line after the other to say it's going to convert this, and it's going to have this, and it's going to have this, it's going to have this. And so it's going to prescribe rather than actually limit. And so it's just really kind of a backdoor way of saying, hey, don't fail to do all of these things, and kind of box staff into a corner. I don't mind if we have something, don't fail to have some sustainability effort in there, but it's going to be, again, very easy to trip over the line. And I mean, to the end statements, they're not just some kind of, short random thought on there. There's a lot of parameters that go around those, and there are a lot of thought that goes into those ends statements and those ends policies. They're not just kind of short declarative sentences that we randomly think of. I mean, we think very carefully about who's it for, what's the cost, and what's the scope of it. And as we all know from drafting these in the past, end statements, ends policies and end statements go to not qualifying a particular outcome, but describing what the outcome is. Policy governance then says CEO and staff translate that for us or interpret that. And as long as it's a reasonable interpretation and we judge if it's reasonable or not, then we can come back and approve that. So there's that give and take, between us and the staff to kind of flesh that out, as opposed to us kind of backdooring it through the executive limitations, say, no, don't fail to have this. And then if he comes back, we can always say, all right, we'll add one more qualifier in the executive limitations. Oh yeah, don't fail to have this. Oh, we missed that, don't fail to have this. So I would rather have an end statement that's well thought out in terms of scope and cost and who the benefit is for, have the staff interpret that and come back to us with something that we like or don't like, and then that give and take will produce a better outcome rather than an executive limitation that just kind of says, oh yeah, we forgot one more, we forgot one more, we forgot one more. So that's my thought of it. I think it's strictly an ends thing, not an executive limitations thing, to me.
Simi, are you okay? All right. So what I will do is I will add that we want to look at when we do our ends review, we will specifically look harder at sustainability and make sure that it's meeting our needs, but perhaps I will also list for us to talk about in November, what does sustainability look like? Maybe some board education on that specifically to help us have a better understanding. And again, we're not going to make any decisions tonight. These are just thoughts. Under educational topics, there were some things that were left behind. One of the things that we're working on in multi-jurisdictional considerations, the difference between our AAATA legal communities and our POSAs, service provision options for microtransit, bus lanes, scooters, vehicle size, et cetera. Also on the list is environmental standards, which may pique your interest, Simi, a little bit. And then town gown resource distribution and the RTA. With that and with us talking about sustainability, was there any other topic of interest to anyone on the board that you'd like to add to the list for us to consider? Kyra.
I just have a question. I don't know if I was asleep at the wheel or what, but I don't know what town gown resource distribution is.
I'm going to wave the flag and say, I don't understand that either.
An issue that has come up from two separate members individually quite spontaneously has been questions raised about how the funding we receive is used with relation to the University of Michigan. And part of this affects our TheRide agreement, but also part of it, to be direct about, is that the university does not pay property taxes, and so there's, I think a sensitivity about how much does the university benefit from something that is paid for by residents and property tax payers, commercial and residential. They do pay. I mean, the program is a good example of that. But I put this issue on here because it had been voiced in the past by board members. And again, two separate, unrelated moments. I thought it's at least worth bringing up. Some of our, one of our longtime commenters, who I probably will do a welfare check on, just to make sure, does occasionally bring up concerns about the MRIDE agreement and the fair price paid by various folks. I believe the situation is quite reasonable, but it is a complicated one, and it is a sensitive issue beyond transit in the community. So if this is not something the board in general is concerned with, you can strike it from the list, but it has been brought up to me a couple of times.
Could you please explain? I then understand what town means, but what does gown stand for? So that we have it clear.
When they graduate, they put on gowns and the mortarboard. And so the phrase town gown is, and excuse me, I'm slipping into jargon. That's the label applied in the urban planning field to any situation that's really describing a large university or educational group and the surrounding community in which it exists, and any points of friction or opportunities for mutual benefit that can arise there.
Thank you. Kyra, did you get everything you needed from that? Wonderful. So does anybody, oh yes, Susan.
So I raise it not that there necessarily is a source to go to, but something that I'm bringing to my role as a board member is an awareness that the world has changed under our feet. And I would love to have someone help me understand where we are in that moment in time as relates to transit. So I'll give a few examples. We have been hearing about remote work and the increasing pressure on the part of employees on employers. They want to remain remote. What does that mean to us as a transit agency that built our service on commuters, a lot of our service on commuters? I'm interested that we may or may not still have rush hours. What does that look like? I'm interested that more and more the wealthy live in the core areas and the people with lesser means live further away. Transit is less likely to be able to serve them out in the out area. In the old days, poor people lived in the city and transit was a key way of finding mobility. I'm interested to know, kind of from maybe urban planning sources, I would like to get educated about the new reality. And I raised this, Forrest was kind enough to give me a few minutes the other day, and I raised it with him, saying that one of the things I'm struggling with is that we use our ridership as relates to pre-pandemic. Well, even at the time of pre-pandemic, our ridership was changing. It was slowing down, it was reducing, and some of it was because changes had already started to take place. And so I'm curious for my own education, because the future won't look like the past, to get a better understanding of where the new reality may be taking shape. I would love to have someone explain what other cities in the transit agencies in those cities are finding. It isn't exclusive to us in our communities. I would love to be educated about that new reality so that I can understand my role as a policymaker for a transit agency, how to serve my communities in this time that is now very different than it looked like when I first started riding the bus, many years ago. So I don't know if that's a work plan topic that can be satisfied, but it's an area that I know I would benefit a lot from an education.
Well, it's certainly, there are a lot of points in your conversation that give me pause, and I don't know if that education is out there right now in terms of, that it's been just such a small amount of time. Are the industry experts working on this? But I think it's a really worthwhile topic, and I will make sure that it is on our list for December to talk about further. Maybe the governance committee could give more thought as to what that means and flesh that out a little bit more. Maybe talk to Matt or to Forrest as well. Were there any other education topics that people may feel over the next year? Yes, oh, I'm sorry. I cannot see you, Rich. I apologize, sir.
I think this is just a more general thought. It seems like especially the last couple of weeks, or sorry, last bunch of board meetings, we seem to be moving more and more, which is great, toward discussions around policy and how we can better author or modify or edit whatever. But I don't know if we can get some education around that, especially things that impact those policies. So for instance, we're talking about environmental, sustainability. I know there's certain federal acts that we'd have to consider when we're creating those or modifying them, such as like the Clean Water, Clean Air Act. I don't know if that's something worthwhile for us to have like a more holistic, bigger picture of understanding like what actually we have to also consider and deal with when we do come up with these policies. But I think the first request then, I guess, is more just education on how we can be better at doing policy. I don't know, we've tried to do trainings, but it's really hard to get the board to those, right? You have to take time off. And so I don't know if there's time that we can slot out where we as a group come together to maybe have Rose come in and give us a training on policy writing. And then the other is then figuring out what it is that we need to further understand in order for us to be better policy creators or editors.
I'm writing this down one moment. Well, we certainly should look at encouraging or asking Rose to be more front and center with us as we are trying to figure out our policies and where we stand with them, our monitoring, how we monitor, and then also how we write them and how we perceive them, and then how do we change them if they're not meeting the needs of the agency. So I will write that down as well, although I do believe that that is really something that we work on constantly, and I don't know that it would need to be on an annual plan of work. But that will be on the list for next month. Anyone else have any suggestions for education? Yes, Jesse.
The line service provision options, I mean, I think that's all, like what they cover there is really, is all important, but it seems particularly broad. So I'm wondering if we can maybe focus that down on like maybe specific topics that we want to get educated on. I guess maybe what made it seem particularly broad was the inclusion of vehicle size, but I think was that going to different size buses rather than just like having like what are the implications of having multiple size vehicles in our fleet? Okay. Something we had talked about before was a pretty common issue right now. It seems to be pretty widely accepted that there's an integral relationship between like city planning, planning decisions, and transportation planning, and not like cities like land use policies and housing, but all of those groups, all the people responsible for making those decisions tend to be kind of isolated from each other, and even like even within a single city government they can become siloed, but then we're like an independent agency. Not to mention we're having to work with multiple jurisdictions. So I think I'm particularly interested in getting into the multi-jurisdictional considerations and figuring out how do we cooperate. So much of our long-range plan involves cooperating with the municipal governments, and I want to get a better idea of what that's going to look like.
Anyone else have any thoughts? Yes, Kyra.
I don't necessarily think anything needs to like come off of the education topics list, but just looking at our policy decisions that we've put on our work plan for the year, I think there's still education that needs to be had around these issues, especially given that we haven't even begun the discussion about equity yet, which is something we've been talking about my entire tenure on the board and is going to be difficult, along with the propulsion and the advocacy. So I just like a note of caution that we have to kind of be realistic about what we can accomplish and get done in a year, especially if we want to do a good job on the topics that we've already committed to.
That's a really good point. My other thought on looking at this is we're calling it annual plan of work, but it certainly doesn't mean that we couldn't consider having an educational topic at a board meeting, especially on some of our lighter agendas, and then that way we could maybe get some more in. But I do agree with you, Kyra. We have the equity discussion coming up in March, and that will not just be in March. I'm sure it's going to continue on for some time. We're working on our advocacy agenda. We just started on local. We still have state federal to discuss. We're right smack at the beginning of our propulsion, and then we're going to be talking about our ends. So that's a really good point that you have there, and something for us to consider when we narrow things down in December. The other thing for us to think about is our own board bandwidth, because we only had one half-day retreat this year, and we pushed the other half-day retreat into 2023. Does then that mean that we're going to have a full-day board retreat or 2 half-day retreats, which would then create 3? So that would be something I think that we should discuss also next month, give ourselves some time to think about it and ponder and really reflect on what is best for us and for the agency in terms of getting these things nailed down. So are there any other topics that we're thinking of at this time? This is a really good, robust, hearty list of ingredients for our recipe for success. So thank you so much for all of your input. I appreciate it. So then if we're going to close that, we're going to move on to 3.2, which is Policy 2.9 update. That is from the Service Committee, and it will be given by Jesse Miller.
All right, thank you. So the Service Committee initiated a discussion at our last meeting about to review Policy 2.9, as we discussed at our last board meeting. We started off with just kind of an initial, just getting people's thoughts on where the policy was at and what they saw as the potential issues with it. And the impression was that the policy was well-intentioned and driven by a desire for collaboration and wanting to encourage collaborative relationships, was probably prescriptive under the guidelines of policy governance. We also talked about certain areas where the ideas that 2.9 is trying to cover might be covered by the Ownership Linkage Task Force. So Rich, I'm very glad that you're going to be able to join us on the Service Committee. So we can, I think there is going to be some overlap in those conversations, kind of determining what is the role of staff versus what is the role of the board in those external relationships. Then following the Service Committee meeting, I had a phone call with Rose Mercier. She was unable to attend our Service Committee meeting, but she will be at the next Service Committee meeting to consult with the entire committee. She wanted to reiterate that her opinions on the policy are relatively unchanged. She kind of said it wasn't, it's not that she didn't have as much of an issue with the content, but that she also felt that it was a hodgepodge of ideas that probably needed to be sorted under other ends limitations, more specific ends limitations. So that's one of the approaches that she'll be taking with us. She encouraged us to focus on in terms of determining what the ends limitations are, that we should focus on the conditions that are unacceptable because they're unethical or imprudent. So not just unacceptable because we don't want staff to do it with, it's not good enough. We don't want the means can't be, we can't specify the means in of itself. There has to be a reason why it would be unethical or imprudent to, anyway, that was mainly her focus, and that the whole point of the ends limitations is to outline unacceptable outcomes, and that those outcomes are unacceptable specifically because they're unethical or imprudent. As we are talking about the overlap with ownership linkage, cautioned us to be mindful that the board not be seen by stakeholders and owners as a way to circumvent staff, so that we have to be very careful that our roles are distinct and that we allow staff to do work and the board will do their own work. So I'm happy to answer any questions if people have. And actually, I might open up to the rest of the service committee to see if there's anything that I left out that they recall from our discussion. All right. Anyone else from the rest of the board? All right. I hope that means I did a good job.
Well, thank you to the service committee. Thank you to the service committee for working on this. It's a really important issue, and we look forward to hearing what comes in the future and how you are going to guide us through this process. And I'm so glad that Rose is working with you all, and sounds like she really has given a lot of thought to this and has a lot of good ideas, so that's wonderful. Next on our agenda is 3.3 task force updates. The first update is from Rich Chang on the ownership linkage.
Yep, thanks. So I just have 3 items to update the board on. The first is that we've been refining the charter based on feedback that we've gotten since the last couple board meetings around the ownership linkage task force. The other is that I would love to have one more member join. Right now it's Susan, Jesse, me, and if we can have a 4th, that'd be awesome. And then once we have that group established, then we will, oh, right? Yeah? Woo! We got a commitment. I feel like I should do like the WDET thing, like ringing a bell or something. All right, so we have our 4. And then what I will do then is reach out to the group and then see if we'd like to meet in December, if we can. If not, then January for sure, to come up with our plan of action moving forward. So thank you. Thanks, Ryan. That's great.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Chang about this subject? All right, then, seeing none, we'll move on to the monitoring task force, and that is Mike Alamang. Mike?
Okay, thank you. I'm sure everybody remembers the last board meeting where you approved using the new monitoring worksheet. And I think 9 of the board did use it. The 2.6 monitoring report, cash and investment. Tonight, we're presenting actually a possible way of taking the results from the worksheets you fill out, present them to the board, and then how the board might vote to replace the way we're currently voting, which is the familiar A, B, C, D, E votes on compliance. Instead, we have 3 different possible types of votes, A, B, C, that's in your package. Looking at what's in the package, I see that a C is missing from the 3rd item. But I hope that was pretty obvious that that's a 3rd way. I might add, in the future, we are also going to be looking about how to organize the follow-up to the results that come out of our meetings in terms of these votes, but we really haven't gotten into that yet. But let me go back to that new proposed simplified motion form of the ABC that's in your package. A is if we agree, or actually individuals all agree that what was submitted demonstrates compliance with reasonable interpretations. That's not yet getting into the evidence. We're just talking about interpretations. B is talking about where we don't agree with all the interpretations, and listing them there, and asking for follow-up, what specifically is needed in terms of follow-up, and then the date to be followed up. Then the C item has to do with the even though there's a reasonable interpretation, where is the evidence not adequate? And you can see the 3 columns there. It would be listed where there were disagreements in terms of either the interpretation or the evidence. And you can see down at the bottom, there's also a definition of compliance, which I think is important. So basically, our thoughts are, these are not final, we're not asking for a vote tonight or anything, but the thoughts are that a particular relevant committee would get the results of what was turned in on the specific monitoring forms, and see who particularly in what particular items in terms of policies there were some disagreements on the interpretation or on the evidence, and they would be listed on this particular form. And the committee would actually decide which ones were they would want to recommend it to the board, because some of the practice that our committee had showed that there might be quite a bit of disagreement. And so on certain things where there might be some disagreement, or some people thinking that the interpretation was not reasonable. If there was 1 or 2, the committee would discuss that, whether that seemed to be enough of the board to recommend that goes to the board to be voted on. If there was 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, even 6 out of 10, that would be pretty obvious that would be a recommendation that would be forwarded to the board. The same would go for both the interpretation and for the evidence. If people do not agree with the interpretation at all, as Rose has educated us on, the evidence is irrelevant. If the interpretation is no good, why bother with the evidence? So that's one thing that maybe doesn't come right out on this particular form, but that's the intent. So with that in mind, with my explanation here, I'd first of all like to see if there's anybody on the task force that would like to expand on what I just said. But in particular, I'd like to hear people's questions about this form, and some discussion from the board about how you think this would work or not work. The important thing here is, and why this is so different, is it really follows the format that we agreed to and we used this last time on actually evaluating the monitoring report. So this flows very consistently out of what would be filled out on that form. It's certainly not at all consistent with the current way we are voting the A, B, C, D, E, although that's the way we're going to vote tonight, because we're not in a position to recommend moving on to this. We didn't have enough discussion of it at the board, but we thought it was important, first of all, to introduce the monitoring form to the board and see how that works, and then move on to how we will actually use the results from that form and summarize it, vote on it, and so forth. And that's what this additional item involves. So first of all, I'd like to see if anybody on the task force would like to add anything before we get into more of a discussion and some questions.
I think Kyra and we just looked at each other and we feel really satisfied with the way you described everything. If I had to add anything, I just think what I really enjoy about this forum is it sets up a series of accountabilities. It's a mechanism for us to not just vote on it and then put it aside and not look at it again until the next. So there's an accountability issue here that I appreciate.
Okay, then I very much would like to hear from the board members. Any questions you have about this particular way of doing this particular form? And any other thoughts you might have about this being a good logical way to do it? Maybe you disagree with it. I'd also really be very interested in hearing people's experience with actually filling out the monitoring report. It was a very simple one. The cash and investments, everybody was unanimous on basically feeling that it was a very good monitoring report, and nobody disagreed with any of the interpretations or the evidence. We'll actually see the results of this next on the agenda, but I think this is a good way to start because it was pretty simple. And I guarantee that we'll be a lot more complicated when we get into other monitoring reports. But anyway, back to this new way of taking that data and digesting it, summarizing it, and getting it to a vote. I'd certainly like to hear people's thoughts, people's questions, anything I just really want your reaction to this because the committee is, the task force, as our chair just mentioned, is very enthusiastic. So please,
So
really.
Mike, Eric has his hand raised, Mike.
Okay,
Go
great.
ahead, Eric.
Sure, I guess I wanted to comment, I don't think we can easily separate interpretation from evidence all that much. I mean, so many times the reports we get from Matt in terms of the monitoring reports, the interpretation is simply, the evidence is part of the interpretation. So often he segues into, my interpretation of this policy is X, and it will be demonstrated when I suggest the following, and then he backs it up with evidence. So I don't think if we, if we separate the two and we leave the CEO with the option of saying, my interpretation of this is X, and I did it, and here's the way I did it, without kind of just in some kind of declarative way, without backing up the evidence, that makes for a very short conversation. So I don't know that we can separate interpretation from evidence all that much. I just don't think we can do that. I think the evidence is the interpretation and in many ways. So I don't think we can separate that. And plus it'll give the board the opportunity to say, yeah, I see what you're saying with this, but there's evidence that, well, let me back up. There may be at times other evidence other board members want to see that may demonstrate other interpretations that were not provided by the CEO. And I don't have a specific example in mind. I'm not citing anything in particular. But I think part of the evidence is a crucial part of whether or not the compliance has been met.
Eric, can I interpret what you're saying, or I'm kind of interpreting what you're saying is that the form that we approved at the last board meeting, which does separate the evidence from the interpretation, it seems to me when you used it, you didn't think that was a good thing to do, is to separate those two, which is what we did on the form that was approved last month.
I was going back to the comment you made, Mike, about, hey, if we agree with the interpretation, the evidence is irrelevant, and I don't think we can do that. So I think they're part and parcel to each other, and so I think we have to combine those in some way. And the just conceptual example I was thinking of is if the CEO gives us an interpretation of something and says, my interpretation is reasonable based on the following evidence, or will be demonstrated by the following, and provides evidence of his interpretation being reasonable, there may be times when some board members say, well, I don't doubt this evidence, or maybe, but the interpretation it supports is maybe unreasonable, and there may be other evidence that I want to see that would support a different interpretation that I find more reasonable. And that's just a conceptual example. Again, it's not something, I don't have a concrete example in mind. But I just don't think I like the form that we had, but the two can't be separated all that well. But on this form itself, I really like the form. I thought it's very short, it's straightforward. Like Kathleen said, it provides a mechanism for us to come back and do some more monitoring throughout the cycle to make sure that we don't lose progress on items that we thought were not in compliance, and that's what we've always struggled with in the past. And it's short and to the point. It's this one-page form that we can live with. So I really like the process overall. I just wanted to reinforce the point about interpretation and evidence working hand in hand.
Eric, again, I'm going to try to interpret what you just said with a different understanding now that you explained what you just did. I kind of inferred from what you said that presenting good evidence proves that it was a good interpretation. Did I misunderstand you there?
No, I'm saying kind of the opposite. Provide good evidence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we find the interpretation reasonable. So in other words, when you're saying, you know, if we agree with the interpretation, the evidence is irrelevant, I think it's kind of the opposite. In other words, I don't want to leave the CEO, and again, this is some conceptual straw man CEO, not our current CEO who's beyond reproach. I just want to say that some CEO is, you know, you could leave them the ability to present evidence that, for lack of a better word, kind of skews the outcome, right, to a certain interpretation. But if we say, yes, that interpretation is reasonable, but I don't know if I can verify or I agree with this evidence, that might skew our view of whether interpretation itself was reasonable, and vice versa. If we think the interpretation might be a little shaky, but the evidence to back it up we find good and verifiable, that may change our view in favor of the interpretation that he provides that maybe initially we didn't agree with. So I hope I'm making that more clear, and my overall point is that you can't separate the two. So I don't think we can say the evidence is irrelevant to the interpretation, because I could see it working both ways. So hopefully that's clear.
I think what you're saying is clear to me, but it's too bad Rose isn't here tonight. I think she has talked to us quite a bit about this particular point at the task force. And basically, what her view is, and I think she's convinced me, and I think she's convinced the entire task force, is you look at the interpretation, period, first, without the evidence. Is it a good interpretation, period? And then you agree with the interpretation. Then was there good evidence presented that supports that interpretation? And there is, she's good at talking about how those should be separated. I'm probably not as good. In fact, I'm sure I'm not as good. But the whole point is, you look at the interpretation first, without the evidence, and is that a good interpretation? And there's some criteria there. A, B, 1, 2, 3, 4. Is the interpretation reasonable? If it is, then you look at the evidence. Does the evidence support what you have in terms of the interpretation? Yes or no?
But Mike, I guess my point is, if it's probably a good thing Rose wasn't here, because we would go down a rabbit hole with this. I mean, my overall point is, I don't think you can say, oh yeah, the interpretation's reasonable, because at some point, board members will say, yeah, I'm not convinced a reasonable interpretation unless I see what you mean by that. And the evidence goes to support that. So I don't think we can say, yep, I fully agree with that. And then we'll see if the evidence backs you up later on. I just don't think we can separate those two like that. So it's probably a good thing she's not here because I would debate her on that point.
If I may, Mike, Mr. Carpenter has his hand raised.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is a great example of everyone being right. And perhaps I can provide my attempt at clarity. As I understand it, I am supposed to, in the interpretation, define what the evidence is supposed to look like. That is a part of my interpretation. The evidence itself is just the evidence. So to Eric's point, a board member could look at what I said would be good evidence of compliance and disagree with the interpretation because it is right there in the interpretation. And to Mike's point, if the board disagreed with the interpretation, they don't need to check the evidence because they've kind of already said, like, this isn't cutting it. And the best analogy I can give you right off the hop is a financial one. Let's say you have a rule that says, don't let us go bankrupt. And my interpretation includes, as evidence of this, there will be money in the bank at all times. That's my evidence. That's built into the interpretation, and you guys can judge the interpretation and the definition of the evidence together. The evidence itself and let's say you all accepted that's a good definition of evidence. And let's say I gave you as evidence a napkin where on the back of it I had scrawled, yeah, there's enough money in there, signed Matt Carpenter. You could agree with the interpretation and say, that evidence doesn't cut it. We want to see a bank statement. We want to see something signed by the CFO. We want to see, get the Bank of Ann Arbor in here, tell us, So you can agree with the definition of the evidence in the interpretation. And I may have muddied the water over the years. I may have, in my learning, described the evidence in the evidence section instead of in the interpretation. So I apologize if I've confused anybody there. But Eric is correct that the definition of the evidence is built into the interpretation. The evidence itself is very Joe Friday, just the facts, here it is, and you can judge whether or not it's good enough, separate from the interpretation. This is the kind of evidence I would give you versus this evidence specifically cuts it. I hope that provides any clarity.
Thanks,
Jesse?
Matt, for doing a better job than I did, and particularly in defining evidence, which is really data.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Thank you. I think I hear, Eric, what you're saying, and I mean it's present even in the policy that we're looking at. That he's saying that he's saying what the interpretation is, and the interpretation will be met when this evidence is provided, and then he provides the evidence, and he's pretty explicit in the interpretation about what that evidence will be. And I think there are times when that is going to be really explicit, but I think there are other times when it's not going to be as explicit, and I guess I'm okay with that. I think back to the treatment of staff. The last time we did treatment of staff, there was Matt had said that compliance will be demonstrated when a survey of employees has 50% or more as agreeing with these statements, and then we had a debate about whether Matt's evidence actually did support that. I mean, his evidence, his interpretation was very clear cut, but I think there was some room for interpretation of the evidence that he provided to see whether that actually met the interpretation. So I think I feel like I can evaluate the two independently, that there's the interpretation and then the evidence may or may not support that interpretation. There will be some times when it's pretty explicit and we'll just be like today, yeah, sure. But there will be other times where it'll be a bit more nebulous.
Well, but you just proved my point, which is you couldn't decide, that the interpretation is straightforward, which you said, but then you said, well, I'm not sure if I can vote for this as being in compliance because I'm not sure if the evidence supports that. So you evaluated them independently, but you're judging them together. I mean, that's the point I'm making. And yeah, sometimes with like this 2.6, it's very clear, like, yes, it's quantifiable, it's pretty straightforward, it's done. The one you just pointed to demonstrates my point, which I think you're also making, which is at times you can't, even though the evidence is Joe Friday straight to the point, maybe we can all agree, which is kind of what the example, the conceptual example I gave to Mike, yeah, we all agree with the interpretation, which is pretty straightforward and clear. However, the evidence, I'm not sure, really supports that. So maybe in some board members' minds, I'm not sure I can vote yes in compliance for this because, yeah, let's judge that a little bit. I mean, I know that's not separate. I mean, those two are working in conjunction together to support whether or not we're in compliance with that. That was my point. So my whole point with Mike is, I don't think you can say, yeah, we agree with interpretation, evidence is relevant, just for the reason you just gave.
I guess I don't think I'm following that. My interpretation of the form is that it's possible for us to accept, that we are given the option to accept his interpretation, but tell him, but your evidence doesn't actually support that, so go back and give us some better evidence. But it won't be a situation where we can say your evidence is good for an interpretation that is like, but your interpretation is way off. They're saying if the interpretation is bad, then it doesn't even matter what your evidence is. But I think that that's specifically what this form is trying to suss out, is that, well, giving us the option to say your interpretation is good, but your evidence is bad. And so what's your issue with that?
No, in terms of the form itself, yes, it allows us to do that. I don't have a problem with the form itself. I just don't know that we can separate the concepts of the evidence and the interpretation being completely separate. I mean, Mike's point, he stated earlier, as espoused by Rose, was if you agree with interpretation, the evidence is irrelevant. That's secondary, and I don't think we can do that.
If I could step in really quick, I think, I don't know if it was misheard or if it was misstated, but what Rose had said was, if the interpretation is not reasonable, then there is no point in looking at the evidence because the interpretation is not reasonable. I do not believe that she said what you had said, Eric. I think it was strictly that if don't throw the baby or out with the bathwater. So if the interpretation is reasonable, of course you look at then the evidence, and is the evidence reasonable, and that takes us down to C. But if we're on B and the interpretation is not reasonable, then there's no point at looking at the evidence at that point because the interpretation is moot. So did that help a little bit?
That's fine. That's not what I heard Mike say, but that's fine. I won't press the point anymore.
Okay, did that help, Mike?
Yeah, I don't know if I maybe didn't state it well or whether Eric didn't hear it well. It really doesn't matter.
Okay. All right, so we've had some really good hearty discussion on this. It sounds like what the committee is going to do then, Mike, if I could reinterpret it, is that we're going to have one more meeting and then bring this back to the full board for a vote and actually implement it? Is that
would be an
the
objection.
process?
Yes, but I would sure like to hear more comments than just Eric.
Did anybody have any other comments or questions at this time? Jesse has one.
In case I wasn't clear, I like the form, so that's my feedback.
And let me emphasize one thing that has to be considered all the time when these forms are being filled out is reasonability. Are you talking about a reasonable interpretation? Are you talking about some evidence that is reasonable? And anyway, that's really an important point to be considered all the way along, as it was in the other way that we were doing the monitoring report.
And so then the other question that you had, Mike, was you wanted to have some feedback on how the board members felt using the form for the first time in terms of gauging reasonableness on the evidence and the interpretation. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I just wondered what people's experience were in filling out that form.
So does anybody have any feedback, having used the form for the first time? And again, it was a brilliant, nice, short policy, so I think it made things a lot easier. Were you happy with the form, or did anybody have any negative comments or feedback as well? Mike, I'm going to take the quietness in the room as the form was fine.
I'll
Okay,
accept that too, Kathleen.
great then. So now that that discussion is done, we are going to move on to 3.4, monitoring. We're talking about 2.6, cash and investments as presented by Dina. And then after her presentation, we will hear again from Mike to hear what the Finance Committee recommends. So Dina, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So you do have a monitoring report on Executive Limitation Policy 2.6, cash and investments in your packet. This report was prepared very similarly to prior reports, but we did make a couple of adjustments based on board recommendations over the past several months. We added a little bit of detail under the interpretation and evidence related to specific information about the level of cash required to allow for necessary cash transactions. We provide a little bit of additional interpretation there and evidence supporting that we are meeting that interpretation. We were more specific about how much money is insured versus uninsured to meet the liquidity requirements of our cash flow. And that is also in the evidence. We also added some additional information about the stability of the bank to provide an unbiased opinion of the health of the bank. That is in the evidence portion of number 1. So we didn't change the interpretation, but we did add additional evidence demonstrating the stability of the bank per board comments. The report was circulated to the board, and comments were received. The report was discussed at the finance. We circulated it as a recommendation of full compliance. And we did discuss the report and the details of the responses from the board at the Finance Committee. There was one recommendation that we did discuss at the Finance Committee, and that was to add an additional column potentially to table 2.6A in your report to be more clear about which of these cash checking and money market balances are insured or uninsured. I'll just note that what we did to address that comment that was made prior and as well in this meeting, we indicated that the CDARS program is fully insured up to 75 million through an asterisk, and every other cash checking and money market balance in that table is only insured up to $250,000 per FDIC. So rather than add a column that had a check mark for every single account other than CDARS, we addressed it with the footnote, but we can certainly look at clarifying that even further in future reports. That concludes my summary of what was discussed at the Finance Committee and the report that we've provided for your consideration. Happy to answer any questions.
And we'll open it up to the board for questions. Dina, Ms. Reed, it looks like we're good to go. I don't see any questions.
Thank you.
So it sounds like, Mike, the Finance Committee, Dina mentioned that you recommended A as in compliance.
Yes,
Did you want to make a motion?
Yes, we certainly did. And I moved that we vote for A, fully compliant.
I didn't hear that. Did you want to make a motion to accept the report as A, or do you want someone from the board?
Can you not hear me? I'm off mute.
Go ahead, I can hear you. He did make a motion? Okay. So Mike did make a motion to accept the report as A. Do I have a second? That would be Jesse. All in favor, raise your hands. Any opposed? That passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone.
And Kathleen, I'd like to make one more comment. Dina mentioned that there was a suggestion made by a board member that really didn't fall under any particular category because everything was judged to be good. And I think at our last meeting of the task force, we suggested, and we will probably have for the next monitoring report, an additional question at the end, just basically a catch-all. Are there any other comments that a board member would like to make regarding the report?
Thank you, Mike. All right, then we will move on to our next item on our agenda, which is 3.5. The reason I added this to our agenda was as I was reviewing our notes from October, our board meeting minutes, the board had wanted to address and entertain a discussion about the construction policy. There were some concerns about the policy that Master Carpenter has raised, but also some of the board members had. And the reason I'm bringing it up, and we don't have anything in our past to address this, is I thought that this might be an excellent opportunity to kick this policy over to the Finance Committee for review, to address the concerns that were raised at the October board meeting, and then if that is okay with the board and with the Finance Committee, that way we can continue to look at our policies and how we address any issues that we may have about our policy writing, and not the monitoring part, but the writing part. Is the board in agreement that it might be a good idea to start at the committee level versus having a full board discussion? And if so, is that okay for the Finance Committee to go ahead and take on the construction policy and address the issues that were brought up at the October meeting?
Yeah, Kathleen, let me mention the construction policy came out of the Servicing Committee.
Oh, did it? Okay.
I'm not sure that the Finance Committee is the right committee.
I know the Service Committee is working on 2.9, and I know that's a hefty lift. Would you be willing to look at it when you're done with 2.9, to look at the construction policy?
I think as long as the board is content waiting for us to finish 2.9 first, I don't think I really want to work on the two simultaneously. And I do think that the work we do on 2.0 will hopefully help set up a good discussion for 2.11. So as long, yeah, I'm willing. I think that's fine taking it on as long as the board is willing to be patient.
Is the board amenable to that? Yes, Rich.
Oh, no, I was saying I support that.
Oh. All right, then that is what we'll go ahead and do then. We will ask the Service Committee to look at it when they're done with 2.9. I just think we've been discussing about how we do follow-up, and I'm just trying to be really mindful of these little things are coming in, and I just don't want to miss anything as much as possible. So until we actually get a plan of action in place. So next on our agenda is 3.6, CEO compensation. In your board packets on page 34 is I guess it would be called not an issue brief, but as information, and there is a resolution. We as a board are supposed to, under policy 3.2.6, according to the board, it's directly responsible to create an annual performance review and appropriate adjustment to the CEO salary. The CEO did have a performance appraisal earlier this year, and he has not had a salary adjustment since 2019. So the governance committee took it upon itself to look at his salary, to initiate a salary study with a company called Korn Ferry, and then have hearty discussion on what would we figured would be a fair and just salary adjustment, and that is what is in the resolution. And I'm wondering if somebody would like to read the resolution out loud? Or I will go ahead and do that. So the resolution is 9/2022, adoption of adjustment to compensation of the chief executive officer. Whereas the Board of Directors of the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority has conducted and concluded a positive performance appraisal of the chief executive officer, Matthew Carpenter, for the fiscal year of 2022. Whereas the board has not increased Mr. Carpenter's salary of $185,000 since 2019, and whereas Mr. Carpenter has provided admirable stewardship of the authority through the unprecedented challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, service restoration, development of the long-range plan, and the cyber attack that happened in the fall of 2021. And whereas, in light of this performance appraisal and lack of adjustment over a 3-year period, the Board of Directors desires to adjust the amount of Mr. Carpenter's salary, and whereas the adjustment must be approved through the Board of Directors by a resolution, and now therefore be it resolved that the Board of Directors hereby approves an adjustment to Mr. Carpenter's salary for the fiscal year 2022 as follows. A 3% cost of living increase to his current base salary for the years 2020 and 2021, a 5% merit increase to his current base salary to a total of $206,080. The application of all increases to take effect with the next pay period or as soon as practicable after passage of this resolution, and all other terms of Mr. Carpenter's employment agreement remain unchanged. And so with that reading, I'd like to open it up to the board for discussion. Yes, Rich?
So overall, I thank the committee for coming up with this suggested package. I think the question I have is, I mean, compensation is not just the salary dollars, right? So there's the other aspects around PTO, retirement contributions, and what I'm getting at is that our goal with a compensation package is to make sure that the person in the role, frankly, has like joy with the job. And I think during the time of COVID, there was a lot of stress. And so the things that I've noticed over just even the last couple of years is that first, I feel like Matt does not take enough time off. And even when he does take time off, I feel like he's actually really not able to shut off. And as a business owner, like my whole goal is making sure that my staff is they're in it, they're excited to be at work, and they're not getting burned out. And that is my big concern right now is I don't know like where Matt's head is in regards to whether he actually is getting like burned out or is still feeling like the more joy than frustration, especially when it comes to being able to take time off.
Go ahead, Eric.
I think as a board, we've been very flexible when Matt has requested prolonged 4 or 5 weeks in a row off and permitted him to jump back in. He's done that several times during his CEO tenure, and we've always accommodated him without making him take short-term disability leave or FMLA leave. So we've on several occasions given him extended weeks off when he's requested it. So I think we've been very flexible in that point. And to your other point about the whole package, don't forget his CEO contract does include annual payments for deferred comp, PTO, and other perks like that. So if you look at his CEO contract, you know, it includes the full package. This is an adjustment to base salary, which is what Matt's focused on this time around, and not to those other things. So that's why it's limited to that. So it wasn't just a consideration narrowly of one thing. It was a consideration of everything. But this is kind of meeting what Matt's needs are at this point. And like I said, we have been very flexible in the past with paid time off.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. That was very helpful. Thanks, Eric.
To be clear that this isn't just coming to the board, and it has gone through a review by Mr. Carpenter, and Mr. Carpenter, to use his words, gratefully accepted, and I appreciate that. And so knowing that, are there any other questions or concerns, or is someone ready to, go ahead, Susan.
Be very brief, and then I'd be delighted to make the motion. So the first one is just a question. I don't know why I didn't catch it my first year. In my old world, fiscal year is the second half of the year. So if the year began in '22, it was described as fiscal year '23. So I'm just clarifying that this is for calendar year '22? Or do we describe our fiscal year as beginning after the budget is approved? Not the tail end of that same year. Again, my old world, it was the tail end of that same year.
The latter. I mean,
Okay.
so it would be, we would retro this, I think, to the beginning of the fiscal year, which was October 1 for us.
Got it, okay, thank you, that's helpful. The second thing was just to raise my own concern, which is that we've allowed 3 years to lapse between compensation changes. And I think everybody knows from their own households, it's nice to find your way to a budget. And if we're stalling on our end, I feel like we haven't done our job for 3 years. So my only concern is that we as a board take action more quickly. The next go around, we don't allow 3 years to lapse. I know there's a lot on the plate. Certainly a lot of it was mentioned here between the pandemic, long-range plan, cyber attack, and so forth. But I feel an obligation as a board to support our CEO with more regular reviews of compensation, just to not let 3 years go. And with that, then I would like to make the motion to put this forward, that we as a board approve this resolution.
Kara, I saw your hand up.
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to kind of echo what Eric said before, is that CEO comp was discussed when we reviewed the CEO contract, which was in 2020, I believe. And at that time, the pandemic was very new to us and things were in flux. And we had a discussion about CEO comp at that time, and it did not make it all the way to the full board, but there were changes made to the CEO contract that adjusted things aside from base comp. So it was a discussion. It wasn't that it slipped off the board's radar for 3 years. It was something that had been brought up, but an adjustment at that time was not prudent for the organization.
So for my understanding, so because I don't participate in that committee, how would the rest of us know what other dialogue is happening?
I believe the board had an opportunity to look at the CEO contract before it was approved.
Thank you for that history, Kyra. So there is a motion on the floor to accept the resolution by Susan Paulet. Do I have a second? That would be Eric Mahler, and all in favor say aye. Pardon?
Do you want to do hands up?
Oh, what is the legality of? Okay, yeah, hands up is fine. Raise your hands. Go ahead, Mike. All right, so that puts it as unanimous. Thank you to the board. Well, first of all, thank you to the governance committee for all the hard work that they did. And I also want to mention that we enlisted the counsel of our previous board chair, Eric Mahler, so that we were able to, I hope, do the best possible job in getting this put forward. So thank you everyone for your hard work, and congratulations to the board and to Matt on accepting this resolution. Moving on, we are now going into item 4, strategy and operational updates. First on the agenda is 4.1, the quarterly Forest Service report by Forrest Yang. Hi, Forrest.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
We in your board packet, page 36, there's a quarterly service record from Q4 FY 2022. We did discuss this report at the service committee. And if you look at the issue brief, I kind of said at the service committee as well, it was a little bit challenging to gather all the data required for this quarter report. But we managed to gather all those data, but some are our best estimate at the moment. We prepared this report, but it does represent the trend, especially related to ridership cost. So I'm not going to go through the entire report page by page, but the key message from this report is ridership continues to recover. Of course, still way below the pre-pandemic ridership at about 60% of pre-pandemic, both fixed route and paratransit. So cost to do business has been stabilized as a result. So cost per ride has been going down, either stabilized or going down. As you've probably been hearing in the past few months, and I would say in the last quarter, the ridership at 60% of pre-pandemic. But starting from September, I think it's September, October was higher than that, but it's still like a way below the pre-pandemic level. But I think initially out of the pandemic last fiscal year budget, we projected ridership at a higher level, but unfortunately it didn't materialize because the lasting time of the pandemic. But it's on target for this fiscal year projection. We predicted like 69% of the pre-pandemic level for FY 2023. So we're on target for that. So at the service committee, we got a request to have a little bit more detailed ridership for TheRide. Let me share my screen. So in addition to the report, I would like to provide you a couple more slides, just give you some ideas about a TheRide ridership and the D2A2 as well. So can you see my screen? Good.
Yes.
All right, thanks. So this chart basically is showing TheRide ridership is from Q1 2019. Back at the time, we only had a TheRide East, which was in Ypsilanti Township. And then starting from Q4 2019, we had Peacefield, we call TheRide West. And then you can tell a similar trend was fixed route ridership. So it was, of course, during the pandemic, it dropped at the beginning. And then we expanded service, expanded service area as a part of the pandemic service recovery plan. So we got a higher ridership during the pandemic. But as of August 2021, we recovered all fixed route services. So the level of service on TheRide has dropped since then, but ridership definitely dropped, but it continued recovered, especially TheRide East. We see pretty stabilized ridership and it continue going up. And West is still less than pre-pandemic. So that's part of the request from service committee. And then we often get questions. I heard a couple of times from LAC members, so asking about the D2A2 ridership. I think in the past, we have been providing some update to the board members as well. But here, I just want to show you a chart showing ridership since October 2021. As you can tell from like less than, so the dark blue line represent total ridership, monthly ridership. And the orange is the direction, one way from Ann Arbor to Detroit. And then the green line is coming back from Detroit. So as you can tell, the total ridership has gone up significantly from less than 1,000 trips a month to over 5,000 trips a month in October 2022. Of course, when you're talking about 5,000 trips a day, and it doesn't seem a lot, especially compared to the service level we provide. Let me show you another chart and give you some ideas. So again, this is a daily ridership, Monday to Sunday. So the green line represent total daily ridership. And then the dark blue, orange and dark blue represent different directions. If you look at the daily ridership, and you can tell during the weekday, it's pretty much flat, around 120 rides per day. And then started from Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I mean, especially Saturday, it's pretty high. But look at, like I said, service hours are different. Like a Monday to Friday, we operate probably 33 hours a day. They're making like 30 trips, I think each, 33 one-way trips, which equivalent to, 16 round trips. And then, but Saturday, we only provide 17, I believe 16 or 17 trips in total. So almost like a half the service, but carrying, more riders. So that's why if you look at the light blue bar representing rides per hour, Saturday, Sunday are much higher than weekdays. So weekdays probably between 3 and 4, but Saturdays over 10. But it's continue going up in terms of ridership. Hopefully we'll see some increase. We also want to initiate some conversation with RTA because this is RTA funded service. See where we can relocate some resources. Maybe Saturday we should provide more service. But that's just some initial conversation. So, and that's all the information I want to speak on today. And then, I'm ready to take some questions.
Thank you, Forrest. We'll open it up to the board for questions. Mike, is that?
Yes, thank you. Forrest, you have a number of rides in there. Could you just give us a little bit of a feel for what kind of capacity the buses are running? I mean,
yeah, that's a good question. Typically on that highway coach, we should have over 40 seats. So which means, each bus only takes 3 to 4 customers each way. But Saturday, you can tell there are over 10 people on a 40-seat buses, right? It's still not a lot. Ideally, we should fill in those buses.
and when I know the funding was for a particular period of time. When does that either run out or has to be renewed? At least that this kind of ridership, that kind of capacity that's going back and forth, that does not look like a real viable service.
I'm not sure. I'm looking at Dina or Matt if they know.
I'd have to,
Sure.
yeah.
Oh, this is Matt. Sorry, Dina. I Zoom talked over you. I apologize. This service is funded entirely by money passed through us from the RTA. So just to be first top, nobody in Ann Arbor or Washtenaw County is paying for this. It's actually state money that was given to the RTA and being passed through there. The RTA has also assigned future federal grants, CMAQ grants, to continue to pay through this through at least 2023 and possibly into 2024. So its financial future is secure in the short and midterm. We don't have anything to worry about. I do have some concerns post 2024. That's the next time the RTA could go to have its own millage. What happens after that is not entirely clear. So that is the funding capacity. So we're good through 2023 and I think into 2024. The question about capacity really comes down to the ridership growth. And yes, right now, each one of these larger vehicles is going with, only a handful of people on them. But this is a service that only started for the first time the tail end of a global pandemic. And it's connecting in Ann Arbor and Detroit, which have not been connected by regularly scheduled public transportation service since the last commuter rail in the state shut down in 1983. So the market for this was completely gone. We are building it from scratch. So I am very excited every time I see the reports coming in from the contractor showing the ridership going up. Mike is not wrong, to be clear, that right now it's low, but it would be low in the first 2 years of any new business, restaurant, whatever. You know, you usually start small, particularly if your market has long since gone away. It also suffers in its design, and we knew this going in, that there's no park and ride on either end, which makes it difficult, and they both go downtown to downtown. So it's a very specific niche market that it's serving right now. But we needed to get something started, and the park and ride was an unsolvable expense when we got this up and running. So we wanted to get something going, and let's build on that success so we go. And it, I think, is moving in a successful direction. Forrest Graph, looking at that, I'd like to see the ridership per hour at least double from where it is on Saturday across the entire service. Like that, to me, you know, pushing 20, 25 boardings per hour would be, you know, just industry rule of thumb, a good number. So he's half of that on our busiest days. So we have some room to go. There's no question about that. But when we made this agreement with the RTA, we're, you know, visioning it and operating it. They're paying for it and ultimately call the shots. Their board asked for performance measures and, you know, how would we judge success? So all of those are in there. And I know the RTA pays attention to these same things as well. The thing that I really wonder looking at numbers like that is there's a whole lot of folks from Washtenaw County going into Detroit on Saturdays. They're not coming back. What are you doing? You know, what's going on? Are they staying until Sunday and then coming back at 1 a.m.? I don't know. It shows up on the Sunday number. But it's growing, and I think that's the important part, as opposed to staying very flat. So that's positive. We have a way to go, though, no question.
I have a question. Are we in competition? I seem to remember several years back that there was a university bus line that would pick up at the Central Campus area and then go from there to Detroit. Are we in competition with them? Does that service still exist? Or are we trying to replace that service?
Good question. That service does not exist. Just before the pandemic, you may remember that D2A2, Detroit to Ann Arbor, started just before the pandemic. We had the worst timing ever historically for launching a new public transportation service. I think there's a plaque somewhere in my office for that. March 2020, if memory serves. It's really awful timing. We had been discussing with the provost's office extensively that we didn't want two services running, so they did shut their service down. We're very interested in how this service would serve their needs as well. So we are no longer we have never been in competition with them. And they were very happy to hear that we were restarting this, perhaps a bit prematurely, but restarting it when we did last year.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the board in regards to the presentation by Forrest? Thank you, Forrest, very much. So we're going to move on now to 4.2, the quarterly for financial report, and that's Dina Reed.
Thank you. So on page 44 of your packet, you have the preliminary draft of the fourth quarter close for fiscal year 22. I say that because I wanted to make it clear that these numbers will change as we move through our year-end process, but this is our first draft of the first close. This report was provided to the Finance Committee and discussed in detail at the Finance Committee meeting. And the generally speaking, the trends for fourth quarter were very similar to what we had seen in the first few quarters or the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year, expenses were trending favorable to budget, slightly under, mostly due to reductions in salaries and wages because of the reduced service for a portion of the year, and also because we did have a savings on for the new A-Ride contract under what was budgeted. That was the first year of the contract, and startup costs were lower than expected, as well as some of the operating costs were under because of the assumptions that were made in the original contract. So just as they have been throughout this year, operating expenses are lower than budget, and consequently revenues are lower than budget. Partially because we use less federal operating assistance and state operating assistance when expenses are lower than budgeted, and also because we are receiving a little bit of softness on our fare revenue due to the reduction in ridership compared to budget, which has been discussed in the service committee reports as well. There was adequate cash flow throughout the period to support operations. And we are estimating that at year end, when we're all said and done, we will be able to end the year with a surplus of approximately $11.5 million, which will go into the capital reserve, which is pretty close to what was budgeted as well. There was one other slight adjustment that I just want to mention in the report. On page 47 of your packet, which is the balance sheet portion of the fourth quarter statement. We have we track our months of operating reserve, and then the requirement is to have 2.5 months in operating reserve. And so you may notice that the actuals for the first few quarters of this fiscal year were updated because we were using the budgeted expenses throughout the year in terms of what our reserve cash would need to be based on budget. But now that we're further through the year and going forward, we're going to base that number on the actual expenses for the quarter. So we made those adjustments, and I just wanted to be clear that your eyes weren't deceiving you. We are still well above the 2.5 requirement and have been all year. We're actually favoring or trending a little bit better than if we had compared to budget, because expenses are coming in favorable to budget. And that concludes my initial report. I'm happy to answer any questions and keep you updated as we move through our audit process and move towards the full year-end close.
Thank you, Dina. I'm going to open it up to the board for questions. I am seeing no question. Oh, Mike. I apologize, Mike. Go ahead.
No, thank you. And as Dina said, we at the Finance Committee did go through the pretty thoroughly, and we're really quite happy with the way the year is turning out. One thing I want to emphasize, and I'm not sure that Dina mentioned, you can see on the balance sheet, the capital reserve has gone up to almost $24 million by year end. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the strategy that we implemented in terms of building our capital reserve. So that's coming right along. However, you can also see in the income statement, we fell about $500,000 short of building up that reserve. We hope to, but we're getting to a very nice level like we have been.
Was that everything, Mike? Did you want to respond, Dina, or?
I would just clarify that if we're slightly under this year in terms of what's going into the operating reserve, it may be, and it will likely be, a function of not having as many eligible expenses, which just means we'll have more money, more pandemic relief fund money to use in the future. Doesn't necessarily mean there will be less going into the reserve overall, but The capital reserve is still expected to be over 30 million as planned and has been discussed throughout the millage process this entire year. So I just want to be clear that we're still on track in total to meet the goals that we set.
Thank you. Did anybody else have any other questions? All right, then that closes this topic. I appreciate that. So we're on to the 4.3, the CEO report. Matt Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Verbal items to update on the report. First of all, I want to apologize. I was remiss at the beginning of the meeting, and I did not introduce the latest of our Hollywood squares here on the screen. Mr. Ken Anderson. Wave, Ken. There you go. Ken is a longtime staff member of TheRide, having served in the planning department and the community relations department. He is acting as the interim deputy CEO for planning and innovation. Gretchen Thompson was doing this. You may remember her from earlier. We're rotating this through some of our junior staff to give everyone a taste of what it's like. And if they don't run screaming the other way, they may be management candidates in the future themselves. Ken's doing an admirable job, and we're very excited, and I apologize for neglecting to mention his presence here at the beginning. Other news on a hiring front, this was the first week for our new manager of human resources. Ms. Monica Boot has joined us most recently from Washtenaw County, where she was director of human resources, and this was her first week. Had her in on Monday, and first impressions in both directions seemed to be marvelous. We're very happy to have her. She seems excited to be here. So welcome to Ms. Boot. Interviews for Deputy CEO of Operations are ongoing and making slow grinding progress. Manager for Public Affairs and Engagement also ongoing, making progress, as are the interviews for the manager of the finance department. So a lot going on. The Great Resignation did catch up with us in the professional ranks, and I'm excited about what the future holds in these areas. A couple items here. First, on the CEO report, I do think is a bit of a victory lap for Gretchen and for Dina and for the whole organization. We were awarded through SEMCOG a carbon reduction grant of $2.1 million. Well done, everyone. To help pay for the Washtenaw Avenue, Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti Express bus service. I'd like for us to note that I did not even get to the start of the meeting for us before I was asked if this money can be used to accelerate the implementation of this service. So I don't know if you owe me money or what, but he and I were discussing this earlier today about how long I had. I guess days, it was more like hours. I am happy to let the board know that Ken and Forrest are exploring the potential to try to move up the start of that service, since we will have money that will not incur financial jeopardy, because we have an ongoing source to pay for this new service with the millage rate. It's just a question of, can we start it early? Two key questions we're looking through there. First of all, can we get access to the money ahead of time? I'm not 100% clear on that. And the second is, do we have the bandwidth, primarily through planning and scheduling, to get this service started? In and of itself, it's not a heavy lift, but there are many competing things also going on, primarily stemming from the millage. We have several other services that are taking a lot of time and attention to get started correctly. And just regular routine service adjustments. 4 times a year, we tweak all the runs and the schedules and the timing points, and it's a considerable effort, and I thank staff who are involved in that. So I look forward to letting you know as soon as we can when the start date of that will be, but for the time being, we're just making sure we manage expectations to say we said it'll start in August of ¡24, and right now that's still the plan, but if we can move it up, we certainly would like to try. Propulsion study, making good progress since last we spoke about this at the retreat, really just educating our community, sharing and geeking out a little bit about the technical report. It has been online now for a couple of weeks. We did do 2 public meetings I think on Wednesday. Thank you to the board members who attended either virtually or in person. We had pretty good attendance and a lot of good questions. And yes, I will be sharing the input from them, because as much as they are beneficiaries that concern me and the means, they are also moral owners that concern you. So I look forward to sharing that information. And it's delightfully all over the place. So if you're looking for clear direction there, keep looking. But nevertheless, it is, I think, a success in that the report and the information staff and the consultant have generated, I think, have focused the community's attention on the key issues behind here. We're not getting sort of outrageous questions one way or the other. Having watched the video or read the executive summary, the comments, I believe, are materially important, generally speaking, and on topic. So a difference of opinion in many cases, or priorities, maybe I should say, but useful opinions nonetheless. The rest of the report I will not speak to, but I do want to add a little election roundup, because something happened last week, and maybe it's worth a few brief comments. There was an election. This packet came out just a couple days after, and my head was still spinning, so I didn't have the forethought to write it down, and a few things have still solidified. So here are some notes that I have to share. So first of all, the election themes. An unexpectedly strong showing from the Democratic Party in the midterms at the national and state level. The abortion issues, both on the state ballot and from the national level, clearly, I'm hearing again and again, were an important factor, as were voting rights in many respects, both initiatives on the ballot and a backdrop to bringing people out to the polls. And intra-party disagreements within the Republican Party, both before the election and especially since, I think are going to become a theme for the next year. At the federal level, the Democrats, unexpectedly strong showing in a midterm election, retained control of the Senate, and I think actually grew it by 1, if I'm not mistaken. The Republicans have been confirmed to control the House. The immediate future in the lame duck session involves the budget. They have a continuing resolution right now to get through the end of the calendar year, and they're going to have to reconcile that with the people who are still in office, I think, before the new folks are seated. Our earmark for the Ypsilanti Transit Center is in that. So that's important to us, what happens and shakes out between now and Christmas break when everybody leaves DC. So hopefully a federal budget will be approved. We will be reaching out to Representative Dingell's office to just check on the status of that. But last we heard, it was her only one. So hopefully this continues to move forward. The Democrats had, I think, an unexpectedly strong showing at the federal level. The Republicans are in a bit of disarray. The Democrats are strong, the Republicans are a little weaker. This suggests the Democrats are going to pursue their agendas, simply because they have the wherewithal to do it, and their opposition may not be as focused or able to stop them, or maybe not. Right? Yeah, we'll see how the cookie crumbles. Former President Trump has declared that he is running for president in 2024. This seems to already be sort of exacerbating the intra-party conflict within the Republican Party. I think that is going to be both a distraction and a feature of the next 18, 24 months of federal politics. Moving down the ladder, transit was on the ballot in many states across the country and generally did very well. The Center for Transportation Excellence, which is an arm of APTA, tracks and provides, it's sort of like a think tank clearinghouse for transit referenda on tips and tactics. We have used it in the past ourselves very successfully. Generally speaking, they did very well across the country, but not in Florida. Florida is a little weird these days for reasons I won't go into, but there were discouraging setbacks for transit in both Tampa and Orlando, where referenda lost, usually by narrow margins, but probably due to gubernatorial races in that state and the dynamics that were being created there. Across the state of Michigan, there were several smaller scale transit millage referenda in smaller communities. All of them passed. So Michigan, good. Florida, when you walk out into cold, just keep that in mind. In Lansing, the Democrats swept it. Congratulations to the blue. All three statewide offices and the House and the Senate. It's the first time in 40 years there has been that kind of Democratic control. I think a lot of people were surprised. There's already lots of chess pieces moving around on state political boards in terms of what's the agenda going to be. A lot of people jockeying for a position. I'm happy to let you know that the Michigan Public Transit Association is up there swinging with the best of them, attempting to move the agendas forward that would benefit agencies such as ours, primarily financial, primarily focused into programs that already exist or that a new Democratic majority may want to bring into existence. Capital, I'm hoping that additional capital funding might be part of that, but we will see how that shakes out. Also at the state level, I think we're going to see obviously the effects of the redistricting commissions obviously had an effect on the legislature and the House and Senate makeup this time, creating more competitive districts, reducing the effects of gerrymandering may have been a strong contribution to the fact that the Democrats are control both houses. The effect of the term limits referenda, which I think was Prop 2? Prop 1, that was Prop 1, thank you. That's going to be felt going forward. Unfortunately for states, I think Representative Robbie, who just didn't miss the cutoff just a little bit, but he will be back to the Board of Commissioners here in Washtenaw County. Congratulations to him. But future legislators will have different sets of terms that they will be able to serve. The hope here is that legislators will be able to spend more time in either the House or the Senate, build up their knowledge and experience, and be able to be more effective both at understanding the mechanics of government in Lansing and understanding how to make compromise and work across the aisle and make good policy all in all. It had been noted that terms limits in the past that had the unexpected effect of creating a bit of a revolving door, and just by the time people were learning how to do their job in Lansing, it was time to go. So perhaps this change will address that. It will be a few years before we can tell. Locally in Washtenaw County, the November general election confirmed what we saw in the primaries, and everyone sort of who did good in the primaries did good in the general election by and large. Strong majorities in Ann Arbor. I think we will see sort of a uniform control on that council. A new mayor in the city of Ypsilanti. I'm not aware of any turnover actually in the township or any of the surrounding townships. I don't know if anyone was actually on the ballot, but if they were, I think they were returned. There are a few new members of the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners, like Mr. Yusuf Rabi. And I think very importantly, the Ann Arbor's climate action millage passed, a resounding, I think 71%. So congratulations to the city and to Mayor Taylor who championed that. So looking at all of this roundup, sort of a lot of questions that will, float around for a while. What will the effects of the Republican Party's disarray be going forward on policymaking and future infrastructure funding? Will the Democrats continue to pursue their green agendas that were sort of shelved in the last session? Will we see continued infrastructure funding and climate action funding at a federal level? At the state level, what will the Democrats do now that they actually control stuff? It's been a long time. They may take a little while or not to figure out what they want to do, but then they may come out swinging hard. It'll be interesting to see. And then one question I've been pondering, and that we made a decision 10 months ago or more that we would have our millage in August as opposed to November. And we made that decision, quite intentionally, knowing that there would be a lot of statewide and federal races in November and some ballot initiatives at the state level. And I think some logic there bore out when I watched the media and how much commercials were going on. I think it would have been impossible to reach voters during the November general election, just given the amount of yard signs I saw on Props 1, 2, and 3, let alone the candidates. I think it might have been difficult to get the message out. So could we have won in either election? Open question. I like to think we probably could have in either case, given the way the Supreme Court's decision on abortion affected how the general election went. It definitely energized certain voters who might have been also supportive of us. So we'll never know. It's a hypothetical, but I did enjoy being able to sit back and not worry about it in November, knowing that we were already kind of safely done. So that's an election roundup. I'm sure there's a lot more that will be coming out in the coming months, but happy to entertain, Madam Chair, any discussion or questions about any of the CEO report items.
So with that, board, do you have any questions for Mr. Carpenter? Go ahead, Brian.
No questions. I just want to say thank you for the report. 2 comments I want to make, though, if I could. First comment is there will be change in the township, Jimmy Wilson. So number 1. And then number 2, I'm going to leave this lie after this. This is my last word on everything with regard to the millage. But I think turnout would not have been an issue. So with so many ballot initiatives driving people into the polls, I think that turnout would have been just as good as it was over the summer. So last comment I'll ever say about that. Thank you.
Mike, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. You didn't specifically call out the transit vote in Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties, which turned out favorable for transit, even though I think there was some doubt about Macomb County in particular. What do you think this means in terms of any implications regarding regional transportation, more integration in Southeast Michigan?
So thank you, Mike. That's an excellent point, and I apologize for not mentioning it. Certainly very strong wins in suburban Detroit. The primary beneficiary there, I think, is SMART. What we saw was Macomb County, which has always supported SMART as an entire county. They don't do the Swiss cheese municipality by municipality approach that Oakland County had previously done. In 2016, that millage passed by a razor margin, I think less than 50 votes, not 50%, 50 votes. It was very, very close. This time it passed by a much more comfortable margin in Macomb County, so I don't know if the temperature is, someone took the lid off a boiling pot over there or what, but the temperature seems to have come down. Wayne County also passed, but that's not a surprise. The real surprise move was in Oakland County, where the Oakland County Board of Commissioners, quite unexpectedly, maybe 4 months ago, put an item devoted to put a transit millage on a county-wide ballot. And this had a couple of important ramifications. I think it was 1 mil or 0.95 mils. And it would replace SMART's funding, but also cover several other parts of, it would be the entire county, first of all. So going forward, Oakland County will no longer have the Swiss cheese effect. And that's a big change in Metro Detroit. This is something that's been a challenge for transit riders in that city for decades, frankly, that you would be going through Oakland County and then suddenly you'd get to Auburn Hills or going through Wayne County and get to Livonia and suddenly you couldn't get off the bus and no one else could get on for a couple miles until you got into the next community where they did pay the tax, and then you get off and on the bus. A horrible approach from a transportation planning perspective. Oakland County has walked away from that and is all in. The funding will go to SMART instead of SMART's own millage, as they did in Macomb, and several other smaller agencies that operate, I think, in the northern part of Oakland County, who will also be funded. It was a bold move by the Oakland County Board of Commissioners, controversial, but successful, and probably an indication of Oakland County's increasingly democratic constituencies, and I mean like big D Democrats, moving into what had traditionally been a very solidly Republican county in the past. What it means long-term, on the surface, it's great news. The Swiss cheese is less cheesy, which is wonderful. SMART has a stable source of funding. Actually, residents in some communities saw their tax for transit go down, which was an interesting fact. The whole county is in, and many smaller agencies will be funded as well. So generally good news. The one question I have heard is this the RTA? And the answer is no. This was Oakland County Board of Commissioners. They control the tax, and they decide where the money is being distributed. So what does that mean for the RTA? This is a good question, and I don't know that I have an answer for you. On one hand, it's good news, and the RTA exists to promote the expansion of transit. In that respect, it's a win. What does it mean for the RTA's ability to pursue its own tax in 2024? I don't know. On one argument could be that it might generate additional support for even more investment. Another argument might be that that was their tax room that just disappeared in Oakland County. And voters there may not be interested in paying two taxes. It also raises a question of the fragmentation of control of funding in Metro Detroit, rather than it be through one RTA, which was, I think, the intent of its enabling legislation. Now the Oakland County Board of Commissioners has a say in how money is getting spent, not the RTA board. So I think this will be an interesting dynamic to watch to see how it continues to evolve. But on the surface, for customers, for riders, for people in Metro Detroit who need to get around, I think it's an unmitigated success.
I actually have a question, if I might. I wanted to go back to your CEO report, and I wanted to ask, I know that we're in the process of interviewing for 2 additional call takers for the Ypsilanti Transit Center. So I'm wondering, does that mean we're looking at having them in place by like January, February? Are we looking at early spring? I know that there are procurement, trying to get the transit center in terms of getting the equipment in there and all of that sort of thing. How are we doing with that?
Excellent question. Thank you. I want to know, Forrest, would you be able to respond to that?
Sure, thanks, Matt. We're hiring that 2 additional information specialists. They may not be stationed at the YTC at the beginning. We're working with IT department, facility services department to get the office ready at the YTC. As soon as that office, equipment is ready, we'll place those 2 information specialists there. We anticipate probably, I would say, January, February.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions, comments? Okay, then thank you so much. Appreciate that, all the information. Looks like we might have some really nice blue skies ahead. Where's the wood? Okay, next on our agenda is emergent items. Do we have any emergent items that need to be brought forward? All right, seeing none, we're on to closing items. Topics for next meeting. Right now we have 1.0, the ends. We also have treatment of the traveling public. We also, I believe, are going to talk about 2.9 again at that point. Jesse, am I correct? All right, so 2.9 will be brought forward by the service committee. And then I also believe we need to re-add the annual plan of work, which will be a discussion and a decision. Have I missed anything? No? All right then. Well, now we're on to public comment. Deb, did anybody happen to tune in and want to speak? Wonderful. So during public comment, well, you've already done all of that. Deb is going to either tell you your name or read the last 3 digits of your phone number, and then you're able to speak for 3 minutes. And welcome public comment, people.
All right, we have Robert Pulowski, and you are unmuted.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, everyone. Robert Pulowski from Southgate, Wayne County, currently in Birmingham, Oakland County. I'm a Citizens Advisory Committee member for the RTA of Southeastern Michigan. And so I want to follow up on the propulsion study. I just want to thank Matt and staff for all the time and effort they put into just getting this propulsion study together, the board, and how much time they spent during the retreat to get this going. It took a lot of effort and a lot of support from the community, but now we finally get to start seeing change in the Ann Arbor IFTU areas and possibly be the first agency in Michigan to go forth with this study. And possibly we'll have other agencies follow all across the state and potentially bring greener environments and focusing on climate change once and for all in this state. The second thing I want to bring to mind is your current job status right now. I'm pretty sure it's pretty common around the area, and it's also pretty much common around here in Detroit that you guys have fulfilled your hiring rates, you guys are fully staffed, and you guys have officially are now keeping up to service levels that you guys need to be. So I commend all the staff for all the promoting they've done to get the jobs out there and retaining drivers. We are still suffering a driver shortage here in Detroit with SMART and DDOT and also our other sister agencies, Detroit People Mover and Q-Line. But Ann Arbor is one of the first agencies to get drivers back into the system and actually go back into restoring full service levels with these new drivers and this fully staffed that we have. So thank you to all the work that you guys do, and just keep the system rolling. The ride is the future, and we're starting to move in that direction, and I'm very hopeful for you guys going into next year. But as always, thank you, and I look forward to talking with you guys in December. Happy Thanksgiving.
Deborah, is there anyone else?
No, there's no one else.
So with that, we will close the public comment, and we are now on to adjournment. Does anybody want to make a motion to adjourn? Mr. Mahler, seconded by Jesse Miller. All in favor, raise your hands. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone, and happy holidays.